Good evening. Welcome to our program. I'm Julie Sherwood, the Education and Engagement Manager for the Wichita Public Library, and I want to welcome you to the final program in our fall gardening series. We've been really pleased to partner with K-State Research and Extension Sedgwick County for this series and their master gardeners.
Just thrilled to be here tonight with you, and hopefully one of the big things that we're going to be looking at tonight is why is our lawn never the greenest one on the block? It always seems like on the other side of the fence or just down the street or on the other side of the neighborhood, somebody's always got that greener lawn. And so what's their secret? What do they know that I don't? And so oftentimes with that, we have to evaluate, well, one, is this lawn really real? Because, you know, artificial turf or some of those green paints, they can trick us into thinking others have the greenest lawn on the block. But tonight we'll really focus on what we can do to have a real, live, healthy green lawn and what that does for our environment. So one of the things that I want to start out with tonight is just speaking briefly on some of the benefits of turf grass and why do we even care if our grass is green and healthy. We'll talk about some of the different types of lawns and turf grasses that you might have. And we'll also talk about planting and overseeding and what we need to do in each of those types of scenarios. We'll also look at fertilizing our lawns, core aerating our lawns, trying to control weeds, and all of those different things with fall lawn care that we can be doing now to really have a healthy lawn all year long. Because what we do now and over the next couple months really sets the stage on whether our grass is successful and whether our lawns are healthy the rest of the year. So these are some of the things that we'll look at tonight. But one of the first things that I want to address, because it always disheartens me to hear, because oftentimes we hear negative things about lawns. Well, they're a waste of space, they're a waste of time, they're a waste of money, you name it. You Google why lawns are bad and you get 15.5 million results on the internet, which is crazy to me because there's so many benefits to having a healthy, good-looking lawn, and we oftentimes don't think about it. Often what we hear is all the negative, things like no pesticides, because I love my lawn and my environment more than, or I love my family and the environment more than my lawn. And I'm here to tell you, so do I. They're not the only ones out there, but there are great reasons to have a healthy lawn in the first place. Some of the benefits of having our healthy lawns is really improving the water quality in our area. A lot of things like oils, greases, household wastes, and chemicals get tied up in our lawns. And so actually having grass growing in these areas where we might otherwise have concrete or bare ground allows those pollutants and those chemicals to get bound to the roots and the thatch of our turf grass. And over time, that allows microbes in the soil to break down those pollutants. And that allows the water that moves through our soils and across our surfaces of the earth to be a lot cleaner if we didn't have those grasses instead. We also want to talk about other benefits of our lawns. Noise reduction is often something that people don't think about, but is one of the benefits of our grass. Typically having a green grass between you and like a road, for example, is going to decrease our noise by as much as 40% as compared to things like our driveway or a street would. It's also going to reduce glare by dispersing the light and increase our overall visibility on sunny days. We often think of trees as being the big things that provide cooling for the environment, but lawns have a big part of that as well, especially in our urban areas. So lawns are actually going to typically be 30% or more cooler than the asphalt or concrete that surrounds it. Even if we had no grass at all and just had bare ground, our lawns are going to remain typically 14% or so cooler than just the bare ground. So when we're in an urban area like a lot of us are and we're surrounded by concrete and buildings and things like that, typically our environment is going to be 10 to 15% warmer than the grassland areas that surround us. And so by having our lawns and having healthy lawns in our own backyard, we can help reduce some of that heat level in our urban environment. Typically, the other thing besides just visibility and cooling that our lawns do also really helps with air pollution and really producing healthy oxygen. Out there every year in the United States, about 12 million tons of dust are kicked up into the atmosphere. And our grass, our lawns are really the areas of the environment that capture those dust particles and bring them back down out of the air into the ground. In addition, we're really improving the environment of our air by the ability for our grasses and our lawns to trap carbon dioxide and produce oxygen through photosynthesis. So as little as a 50 by 50 square foot of lawn, that's 2,500 square feet. That's, I would say, the average size or smaller of most front yards. That little bit of grass is enough to produce enough oxygen for a family of 4, which is really cool. So if we think about our lawns in some of these terms, where we're actually producing oxygen for a family of 4 every year by just having that small, healthy patch of grass, that's really cool to be thinking about as far as one of the reasons we might care about why our lawns are important. And if nothing else, money talks. And so oftentimes having a green, healthy lawn in front of our property can also increase our home values, sometimes as much as by 15%. And so all of these benefits are really reasons that we want to care about why our lawns are important and why it's worth spending the time and the money and really the sweat equity that sometimes it takes to get these lawns up and healthy. So we know that lawns are important for many different reasons, but what type of grass do we have growing in our lawns? And tonight we're really going to try to focus more on what we call the cool season grasses. And that's going to be things like tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, ryegrass. These are going to be the types of grasses that are really going to benefit the most now from the type of maintenance and care that we do. So typically our cool season grasses, they're going to be most vigorous and most actively growing in the spring and the fall. And so that's why doing fertilization and planting, things like that, are going to be most effective now versus other times of the year. So the alternative to cool season grasses, just to help clarify for those of you that this may be a new term for, the opposite of our cool season grasses is going to be the warm season grasses. So our warm season grasses are things like Bermuda grass, zoysia grass, buffalo grass. All of those are perfectly great lawns to have. I actually have a Bermuda grass lawn myself. And so with these types of lawns, the same principles are going to apply, but our timing is going to just be a little bit different. So with our warm season grasses, typically mid-May to June is going to be the ideal time to do a lot of the things that we'll talk about tonight. So even though the principles are the same, the timing is going to be a little bit different with our warm season grasses. Whereas with tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, September in general is going to be our ideal time to get busy with fall lawn care. And one of the biggest reasons and one of the biggest ways that people are often able to differentiate warm season and cool season grasses is typically our cool season grasses are going to be greener during most of the winter. And you can see here some winters that's not necessarily the case. We don't have that green lush lawn all winter long. But in the base, if you kind of look down beyond the brown tops of these grasses and you look at the base of the plant, you can still see green down there. And so our tall fescue lawns, especially our cool season grasses, they're going to be alive and growing during the summer or during the winter months. They may not be perfectly green, but they're still green at the base. And that allows our cool season lawns like tall fescue to be one of the earliest grasses that greens up in the spring because they're able to handle those cooler conditions. So when we talk about cool season grasses, there's a lot of different types of grasses that could include. Tall fescue is the one, I would say the most important one that we'll focus on tonight, especially for our area here in South Central Kansas. Tall fescue, even though it really prefers the cool, wet weather of the spring and fall, it's able to tolerate the heat and the drought that our Kansas summers really have a tendency to throw at it here in South Central Kansas. Often tall fescue, if it's unirrigated, it may go dormant in the winter or in the summer months, the heat of the summer. But if we're watering our tall fescue lawns in the summer, typically we'll be able to keep them green or fairly green for most of the summer. Whereas if we look at some of these other types of cool season grasses on our list, fine fescue is one of them that comes up, but fine fescue is not going to be a great option for our area. Typically fine fescues like the creeping red fescue, the chewing fescue, a hard fescue, all of those are going to be great grasses, but just not in our area. So if we lived up in Nebraska where it's a little bit cooler in the summer, where they get a little bit more rainfall, that would be a great grass to grow. But because of the heat, the drought, the extreme environmental conditions here in South Central Kansas, we really want to probably avoid fine fescue for the most part. If we have to pick a second best grass in this list, Kentucky bluegrass is probably going to be our second best grass. And you'll find a few Kentucky bluegrass lawns in our area, but by and far of all the cool season grasses, tall fescue is going to be the most predominant. We also have annual bluegrass, which is really a weed. for most people. And then we also have ryegrasses. And so we have an annual ryegrass. Annual ryegrass just indicates that it's an annual plant. So it's planted in the spring and it dies at the end of the year. So usually annual ryegrass will start in the fall and die in the summer heat. Same thing with perennial ryegrass. Because it's a perennial, it comes back year after year after year. But both types of ryegrasses really struggle in the heat and the drought of summer. And so it's important that we recognize which of the types of cool season lawns do best in our area, because if you go out and buy grass seed, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, you're going to find huge differences in the quality and the types of grass seeds that are available to us. Oftentimes, one of the challenges with growing a lawn in our area for a lot of people is trying to find the best type of grass to grow in the shade. Fine fescue is actually going to be one of our most shade tolerant plants, but it just doesn't love the heat and the drought that often come with our area. So if we're looking for a grass that's really going to tolerate the shade, of all those cool season grasses that we mentioned, tall fescue is really going to be our best option. So not only does tall fescue then have some heat tolerance, some drought tolerance, and shade tolerance, we really have a lot of different reasons why this is becoming, or is, the most popular and one of our best cool season grasses to grow in our area. The warm season grasses, zoysia, buffalo grass, and Bermuda grass that we mentioned earlier, typically they're going to be excellent grasses. And especially if we have a full sun lawn, all three of those are going to be great choices. They're also typically going to need a lot less water than any of our cool season grasses would. So they're great for the environment because they take a lot less maintenance and can really still look good even without some of that maintenance. Of all of those warm season grasses though, zoysia is typically going to be our most shade tolerant plant or type of grass for the warm season grasses. But again, it's not going to love a whole lot of dense shade. So even if we have a warm season grass like myself, I still have to have a few areas of my lawn where I sprinkle in tall fescue because the shade is just too dense and those tree roots are just too much competition for those warm season grasses to really fill in and do well. So we're talking about all the different types of grasses and now being an important time to do stuff. And so what are some of those things that we need to be looking at right now? Planting and overseeding are definitely one of those things that now is going to be the ideal time to do, especially in our tall fescue lawns. But for tall fescue and Kentucky bluegrass, fertilizing, core aeration, weed control, all of those things are going to be really important over the next few months. So one of the things that I want to clarify for people is when we're thinking about what we need to do to our lawn this fall, we have to think about what some of the restrictions are as well. So typically, if we are planting or overseeding, planting new grass seed this fall, we can definitely be fertilizing, we can definitely be core aerating, and those are all going to help our grasses be healthier the rest of the year. But if we're not planting a new lawn, we have some other alternative things that we can do, especially related to weed control. So if we're not planting our lawn, we can focus more on weed control, controlling those broadleaf weeds and applying pre-emergence to prevent future weeds. The important thing though is that if we're overseeding or planting new grass seed, we want to be careful what type of weed control techniques we use because oftentimes those products can actually be detrimental to the growth of our new seedlings. And so we want to be careful what we do if we decide to do weed control this time of year. So before I go on, is there any questions, Angie or Lindsay, that we need to address kind of related to the stuff we've talked about at least?
We have quite a few questions already. Maybe you want to answer, well, I'm thinking that you probably will get to some of these. It might be best to just wait and see if you answer some of these questions in your regular presentation.
Perfect. Well, let's talk about planting here real quick and see if that gets taken care of some of the questions. So we've talked about now being so important, September, late August, and why is that? And just like this joke indicates, it's all about timing. And so when we think about September, there's a lot of reasons that make September an ideal time to take care of a lot of this. Typically with September, late August into October, our soil is going to be very warm. Our daytime temperatures are warm. We've had the sun all summer long heating up our soils. So that allows new grass seed that we put out there to germinate and to grow very quickly. During the fall, September especially, we get typically warm days, but cool nights. And so that allows really vigorous and active growth during the daytime, but then allows our grass to have a little bit of a reprieve or a break during the evenings where they have time to recuperate from some of that stress in that cooler temperatures of the evenings. The other great thing about September and the fall is oftentimes we have a lot less weed competition. You think about the spring and everything is trying to turn green all at once when we get to spring. And so if we're trying to plant a new lawn in the spring, it's often a little bit more difficult because we have a lot more weeds that take advantage of our spring plantings rather than in the fall. So one of the things before we get too deep into planting that I want to make sure we clarify is what is the term overseeding and how is it different than starting over? So typically if we're going to be starting over, what we're talking about in that type of situation is planting a brand new lawn. Basically, we're starting with bare soil or mostly bare soil, and we're planting grass seed over the whole thing. Maybe you have a scenario, I have a couple in my yard to be honest, where maybe we have a few more weeds than we do grass in an area. And so if we're gonna try to kill out those weeds and start with a blank slate, that would be starting over. Whereas if we're talking about overseeding, what we're trying to do is thicken up an existing lawn. Maybe we have a lawn that has done pretty well this summer, but the last few weeks of drought have really stressed it out. So we're starting to see bare spots that need to get filled in. So overseeding is basically starting with a lawn that's already existing and just trying to fill it back in. And so when we have a lawn that looks like this, what do we do? And I think this is a great example of one, first, don't panic. It can seem really frustrating to not have that thick, healthy lawn like we want, but now's the time to correct it. Because the reality is, even our best adapted plants to Kansas, the summer heat takes its toll on everything. And I think if you drive through neighborhoods or you drive around the county much, it's been dry, it's been hot, and so things look rough. But if we have this type of scenario with our lawn where we've got some existing lawn and we just need to fill in those bare spots, this is going to be the perfect example of trying to overseed, because we're just trying to improve that existing lawn and create a thicker, denser, healthier lawn. The one important thing where overseeding is a little bit different than starting over is going to be the amount of grass seed that we need to accomplish that. And the important thing with overseeding is typically we're only using about half the recommended rate of grass seed in those areas because we're accounting for the existing grass that we already have growing. And we don't want to put too much grass seed down in an area because too much grass seed is going to cause competition among the grasses. And so there's no point in our lawn beating itself over the rest of the summer. So with planting, with overseeding, starting over, whatever we're looking at, typically anywhere from late August to mid-October is going to be the ideal time to do it. I would say mid-September is probably ideal for most people, but we can start now in late August. Typically in late August, we're going to get very quick germination. The seeds will sprout as quickly as ever if we plant them now. The important thing to know though, if we plant now in late August, is we're going to need more water or more irrigation in order to keep those seeds alive. If we have an irrigation system in our lawns or in our yards, it may not be a problem. We can maybe water to keep up with the needs of that new grass seed. But maybe we don't have an irrigation system like myself. Typically what we're going to be better off doing in that type of situation is waiting till about mid-September to plant our grass seed. We're still going to get really quick germination and really quick growth on that grass seed, but typically because it's cooler and maybe there's a little bit more rainfall, usually it's going to need less supplemental water from us, which just makes our job easier. The important thing though is we want to try to get that grass seed done and planted before October 15th. And the goal here is to basically just have that grass seed growing and have a root system established before we hit the dead of winter. And like we mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that if we're planting grass seed, we're not using any kind of pre-emergent products to control weeds in our lawn. Because a pre-emergent product doesn't differentiate between a weed seed and a grass seed. A pre-emergent product stops all seeds. And so we want to make sure that we are careful to not be our own restriction in the success of our newly planted lawns. So if we're trying to either overseed or start over with a new lawn, what are some of the steps that we need to look at? And one of the first things that I would encourage people to look at is considering a soil test. And soil tests are one of those things that I look at from the perspective of we're detecting invisible problems in our soil. What a soil test is going to do is it's going to evaluate the nutrient levels of your soil. And so oftentimes people have a weird pH or excess or low levels of some types of nutrients in their soil. And just looking at a soil isn't going to be able to oftentimes tell you what's wrong with it. So the soil test is our way to detect some of those invisible problems. But if we are doing a soil test, we want to make sure that we plan ahead. And so Angie's dropped in the chat there some information on soil testing if you're interested. But like I said, you want to make sure that you're planning ahead so that you have those results back and so you can still meet some of those deadlines that we talked about in the previous slides as far as getting planting done. And the one reason that I would say soil testing is so important before we start to plant is if we have big problems in our grass or in our soil, we need to try to address those before we get our planting done, because it's so much easier to do when we're starting over to adjust the soil and make those adjustments rather than once that grass is growing. So if we need to adjust the pH and till in some type of material to do that, we can. If we need to increase our phosphorus or potassium levels, oftentimes those nutrients sit on the soil surface if they're just applied there. And so by mixing them in, we're really improving the success of getting those nutrients down and correcting those problems. But if we wait till our grass is planted, we can still do some of those things. It just takes a lot more time and typically is going to take a couple years to accomplish rather than getting it all done at once. So somebody already had asked about fertilizing. What do you do if you're planting new grass seed? And so typically, unless we have a soil test recommendation that says your phosphorus levels are high, a starter fertilizer is recommended. Basically, that's going to provide nutrients right there at the soil surface for those seeds to be able to take advantage of right as soon as they start to grow. It's going to help encourage good seed germination and rapid growth of your lawns. But the reality is a starter fertilizer isn't a necessity. The reality is most parts of Kansas have high contents of phosphorus and potassium in their soil. So those nutrients are often present in adequate amounts for our grass seed to be able to use and grow well. So like I said, the soil test is your way to know for sure what your soil test levels are, your soil nutrient levels are. But a starter fertilizer, as long as you're applying it correctly, generally isn't going to hurt. So if we're planting a new lawn, one of the things that we may want to also consider is dealing with some of the weeds that we have growing, whether that's crabgrass, whether that's more noxious weeds, who knows what those could be. Maybe it's other types of grass. For some people, Bermuda grass is a weed they don't want growing in their tall fescue lawn. And so whatever the case may be, we want to make sure that we are controlling those weeds or undesirable plants safely and efficiently. So typically, if we're going to be planting a new lawn or trying to control some of those weeds, we want to typically use a product with the active ingredient glyphosate. Typically, glyphosate is going to kill any green leafy material that it comes in contact with. But the important thing about glyphosate and what differentiates it from a lot of the other chemicals for weed control is going to be the replanting interval. Basically, the amount of time from when you apply those products to when it's safe to plant. And typically for most glyphosate products, if you read the label, there's going to be a section that says replanting interval or planting. And on most all of those labels, it's going to be safe within 1 to 3 days after applying that product to then go ahead and plant your new grass seed. So that allows a really quick turnaround and not having to wait weeks or months before it's safe to plant. Typically, if you are going to use glyphosate, I would still encourage you to do it maybe 2 weeks ahead of your planting. And that way you can make sure that you get all of the weeds you're hoping to control, because some weeds are going to take a couple applications. So if we spray 2 weeks before our desired planting date, we can kill everything off, rake off the dead, and see if anything comes back up. And if we do, we can hit it a second time with a second application and hopefully really get it for good that time. And then, like I said, within 1 to 3 days, most of those products are safe for you to seed back into that area. You do not want to use glyphosate, though, if you are just overseeding and have that existing lawn. Glyphosate is going to kill all green plants. It doesn't care if it's a weed or if it's a desirable lawn. So you can maybe spot treat in the lawn and just kill certain sections if you have a problem in certain areas, but don't just go applying glyphosate over the whole thing, because that can really cause problems. If we have an existing lawn, one of the best things that we can do before planting is mow it a little bit shorter. Mow it to 1 inch tall, maybe 1.5 inches tall, and that's going to allow more sunlight to get down to the soil and just help that new grass seed grow as quickly as possible. And before we get ready for planting, we want to make sure that we are probably not using a selective herbicide. Things like some of your broadleaf weed killers, oftentimes those are not going to be safe to do if we're overseeding. You want to read those products carefully to pay special attention to that replanting interval, because oftentimes it'll be a couple weeks to a couple months before the label says that it's safe to plant new grass seed. And again, we don't want to be the reason that we're limiting our own success. We'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but just a good reminder there. And so lastly, when it comes to preparations for your grass, we want to adjust our pH, adjust our nutrient levels, follow that soil test recommendation if we have anything wrong. This is also a great time to maybe add compost to our soils, to maybe add organic matter or improve our organic matter levels. In a sandy lawn or sandy soil, our compost or organic matter is going to help hold more water into the soil or increase our water holding capacity. In a clay soil, it's going to do the opposite. Adding compost or organic matter actually helps improve our drainage so that our soils don't get quite as compacted. And it's also a great time before planting to adjust any slopes or grades that we might need to get rid of low spots or provide positive drainage away from the house or foundation. And to me, this is the most important step of the whole planting process, is purchasing new grass seed. Oftentimes the advertising can be great sounding. There's donut seeds available for planting. But if we don't start with good quality seeds, we're never going to get a good quality lawn. And so purchasing grass seed to me is really the make or break point in trying to establish a new lawn. So when you go out to purchase grass seed, there are a ton of different options out there. They're all branded differently. Some of them are sparkly, some of them aren't. But it's important to know what's in those grass seeds that we're purchasing and not just look at the outward physical appearance of the bag. Because let me tell you, the outward physical appearance is no indication of quality. Basically no grass seeds are the same. And so we want to make sure that we understand what's in that grass seed before we purchase it. The reality is you're going to have to pay a little bit more for a high quality grass seed. But hopefully after the next few slides, you'll understand why that's so important and why it's worth spending the extra money to do so. Because really creating a quality grass seed is going to be what creates a quality lawn. And so if we cheap out and get a poor quality grass seed, typically we're always going to expect a poor quality lawn, even if we do our best fertilizing, mowing, all those other things to take care of it. So like I said, to me, this is really the make or break of fall lawn care. Oftentimes when it comes to purchasing Tall Fescue seed, a lot of people are familiar with the term K31 Tall Fescue. And this has been a standby type of Tall Fescue for many years. Typically it's going to be one of the most toughest Tall Fescue varieties out there. So it's going to be a great choice for large open areas or low maintenance areas. Oftentimes great for like big open country lawns where people aren't irrigating or aren't fertilizing as frequently. It's very disease tolerant, so it's a tough grass, but typically the downside of Tall Fescue is it has a very wide leaf blade, and so it has a lot coarser texture. It's never going to look quite as smooth as some of the other types of Tall Fescue will. So typically if you're going to go buy a bag of Tall Fescue, I would encourage you to look for some of the newer cultivars of Tall Fescue out there. And what we often term these as is turf type Tall Fescues. Basically, these are going to give us a lot better performance than some of the old varieties of Tall Fescue will, and give us ultimately that higher quality lawn. We're going to be, with these new varieties of Tall Fescue, looking for things like improved, darker, greener color. We're going to have a thicker, stronger density. We're going to have finer, softer textures, which are going to give us a more carpet-like appearance with our lawn. There's a wide variety of different cultivars of these turf-type Tall Fescues out there, and they're each going to have their own benefits and characteristics. So the reality is, if we're going to go buy a bag of grass seed to plant this fall, ideally what we want to look for is a Tall Fescue blend. And basically that's just going to be a mixture of different Tall Fescue varieties that have been shown to do well in our area. Typically, these tall fescue blends are going to have anywhere from 3 to 5, maybe a few more, different varieties of tall fescue. The great thing about a lot of the seeds that you're going to find, the tall fescue blends that you get from your garden centers and nurseries here locally, is often the seed dealers are using the research that we do here at K-State. And you can see the John C. Pear Horticulture Research Station in the photo here, where we're actually testing all of these individual varieties of tall fescue to try to figure out what grows best in our area, what has the best disease tolerance, and those types of things. And so the mixes that you're going to find in those bags are going to vary a little bit from year to year, but typically those tall fescue blends are going to be a great choice for most homeowners when it comes to a type of grass seed to purchase this time of year for your lawn. So when you look at that bag of grass seed, don't be swept away by the outward appearance or the fancy branding on the bag. Look for the label. Every bag of grass seed has to have a label. So it's on the bag somewhere, usually on the top of like the bag where the seam is, or maybe on the back side of the bag. And what you see here on this bag of grass seed is we actually have 5 different types of tall fescue. So this is a great example of a tall fescue blend. We have Avenger 2, we have Firecracker tall fescue, Titanium, Spider, Screamer tall fescue. All 5 of those tall fescues are going to have different characteristics and different genetic variability. And so the reality is one of them may struggle in one area of the lawn, one may not be as disease tolerant, one may not be as shade tolerant, but hopefully having that nice mix of genetics is going to allow other types of tall fescue to really thrive in those areas where some of the other tall fescue don't. But not just having a nice blend of tall fescue is important, it's also extremely important to be conscious about the weed seeds and other crop seeds that might be mixed into the bag. And just like you see here on this comic, it's so easy to love and love and love your plants and they still struggle or don't do well. But you give a dandelion a crack or another weed just a bare spot in the lawn and it's gonna take off. It's gonna act like it's having the time of its life, regardless of how much we've tried to grow other plants in that area. And so if we have weeds that grow this easily in our own lawn, we want to avoid planting them when we're planting tall fescue or we're planting new grass seed. So it's also extremely important when we look at a bag of grass seed to look for 2 areas on the label to say weed seed and other seed or other crop. And typically these are going to be an indication of how much undesirable seed is mixed into that bag of grass seed. Oftentimes we're really concerned about weeds like orchard grass or annual bluegrass because both of these are weeds type seeds that are perennials. So they come back year after year after year. So once we plant them in our lawn, it's really difficult to get rid of them other than just killing the whole lawn and starting over. And so especially with that other crop seed, other crop basically just refers to any other type of grass species that's mixed into that bag unintentionally. So that can be other types of grass like Bermuda, that could be pasture grasses like blue stems. And so it could also include those orchard grass or bluegrass things that we've talked about. So we want to know what's in those bags and try to avoid these weed seeds and other crops as much as possible. So ideally, we want to first find the label of these bags of grass seed and figure out what's in it. And like I said, generally it's either on the top of the bag along the seam or maybe on the bottom corner of the back side of the bag somewhere. So pay special attention here to the % weed seed and % other crop. And so I want to take a couple minutes here to look at a couple labels of grass seed to really help you understand what you're looking at and what's important to pay attention to. So oftentimes there's a lot of information on these and we don't care about most of it. What we do care is what's in the bag of grass seed. And so here we have Reunion tall fescue, Compete tall fescue, and Stetson II tall fescue. Basically, this indicates that we have a tall fescue blend because we have 3 different varieties of tall fescue. The % purity over here to the side just tells us what ratio those grass seeds are combined. And so in this bag of grass seed, we have about 1/3 of each of the different varieties of tall fescue. So it's a nice, good mix. The next thing we want to look at is the % germination. And typically 90% or higher germination is going to be a good quality grass seed. The higher the number, the better chances of having healthy living grass seed, basically. So that means out of all of the Stetson, the second tall fescue seed in this bag, 90% of that seed is going to be alive and will grow if we plant it. But 10% of it is dead grass seed that even though we plant it, even though we water it, it's just not going to grow. And so it's important to make sure that these numbers are as high as possible so that as much of the bag is good grass seed as possible. You'll also see origin on most of your bags of grass seed that tell you what state these grass seeds came from. 90% of the time it's probably going to be Oregon, but it just tells you what part of the country that grass seed is grown. Down here in the other ingredients though, that's where we're going to find the percent weed seed and the percent other crop seeds. Both of these are 0.00%, which is ideal. That's the type of grass seed that we want to pay a little bit extra for so that we're not planting weed seeds at the same time we're planting our grass seeds. You'll also find on all these bags of grass seeds something that says inert matter or inorganic material. Basically, those are just things that are mixed in with the grass seed that help it spread more evenly once you put it in the spreader to get it spread across your lawn. So not something that necessarily needs to be concerned with. Just know that that's helping you spread that grass seed when you get it home and not getting it all stuck together. You'll also see oftentimes a sell-by date or a date when the bags were inspected. So that also gives you a good indication on how many years maybe that bag of grass seeds sat on the back of a storeroom shelf or in a back corner and was forgotten before it got put out for sale. Hopefully that's not a problem anywhere you go, but that information is on the bag for you to know. Ideally, just like the food you buy at the grocery store, the fresher it is, the better it is generally. Quickly, we'll look at a second label of grass seed just so that you can compare. Here, you're actually going to find 5 different types of tall fescue. So to me, this is even a little bit better bag of grass seed because we just have a little bit more genetic variability. Here, the percent purity, basically 25% of this grass seed is going to be Avenger 2. And then about 20% is going to be these 3 varieties of tall fescue, and 15% is going to be the Screamer variety. So again, it's a pretty good even mix, even though one number is a little bit higher than the others. Here we have a germination of 90%, so 90% of all of that grass seed in the bag should grow if you plant it. And again, the important thing to note here is 0.00% other crop and 0.0% weed seed. Those are all the things that we want to make sure we're paying attention to. And the reason that this percent weed seed and percent other crop is so important is it's not an indication of the number of grass seeds that are in the bag. It's the indication of the number of grass seeds in there by weight. And think about weed seeds, often they're very small, so it takes a whole lot of weed seeds to actually measure up to a measurable amount. And one of the tricky things with these 2 categories is unless they're 5% or more of the total weight, the grass seed manufacturers aren't required to figure out or tell you what those weed seeds are or what those other crop seeds are, unless they make up 5% or more of that total bag. So then that leads to the question of, well, how much other crop or how much weed seed is too much weed seed? And that's a difficult question to answer. And honestly, it's going to vary from person to person a little bit and your tolerance for weeds in your lawn. But across the board, generally that number and our tolerance is going to need to be very low. It's going to depend on what those weed seeds and what those other crops are. And typically things that are relatively harmless like annual ryegrass are really not going to be as much of a big concern as things like orchard grass or rough bluegrass, things that are going to come back year after year after year. But there's no easy way of knowing what those other crops or other weed seeds are. And so ideally we want to get as close to 0 as possible. And this is really important when we talk about the total amount of weed seeds that are in those bags based on the weight of the bag. Because we all know that grass seeds, tall fescue grass seed especially, is a really small seed to begin with. You're going to be able to hold a whole lot of them in the palm of your hand. But the reality is our grass seeds, our weed seeds are going to be even smaller than our grass seeds. So here's an actual size of, for example, a clover seed compared to the size of a tall fescue seed. These weed seeds are often dust-like. They're going to be so tiny that you're not oftentimes going to be easily able to see them. And so when we start to compare the size of those weed seeds compared to the size of a grass seed, we have to think about the weight, because these weed seeds and other crops are measured by weight of the total bag. We have to consider how those compare. Because technically in 1 pound of tall fescue grass seed, If it's just tall fescue seed, you're going to find 200,000 seeds of tall fescue approximately. But if we take that same weight, 1 pound, and count the number of white clover seeds that are in 1 pound of seed, that's going to be over 800,000 seeds. So the weight really doesn't necessarily give you a good indication of the total number of seeds in that bag, because it's going to take 4 pounds of tall fescue seed to equal the same number of seeds that you would get in just 1 pound of white clover. So even just a little bit of weed seed, even a small percent of weed seed, really can make a big difference in the overall quality of that seed, because it doesn't take much of those weed seeds to have a large number of weed seeds in the bag. So for the most part, what we're going to say is half of 1% is what's going to be the amount that can ruin a bag of grass seed. So that's just 0.05%, half of 1%. And ideally, because these are so small and weigh so little, we don't want the weed seeds to outnumber the desirable seeds that we actually hope we're planting. So ideally, we want to have as close to 0 as possible on the other crop and percent weed seed. But if you have to have a little bit in there, what we'll say is a good quality seed is about 0.01% or less other crop, or 0.01% weed seed or less. Ideally as close to 0 as possible. Another good indication of a high quality grass seed is oftentimes you'll find bags of grass seed that say they're certified seed. Basically, they've inspected the grass seed and they've looked for weed seeds, and they can verify that there are no weed seeds in this bag. And so certified seed is going to be a great indicator of 0% weed seed and 0% other crop. And if you haven't gotten my point already, I want you to take a look at my shopping trip this last weekend. I went to some of the big box stores and places where you can find grass seed, and looked at what they had on the shelves. And you find a whole heck of a lot of things out there. But this is the majority of the products that they were selling at these different locations. And I want you to look at the bags and take just a minute and figure out which one you might want to purchase. Just looking at the bag itself. Would you pick maybe the shiny gold one? Maybe you'd pick one of these 2 bags that say it's a sun and a shade mix because you have trees in your yard, and so you have both. Maybe you have a tall fescue blend here. Maybe you want a Midwest mix. Well, just looking at these bags of grass seed is not going to be a good indication of whether or not they make a good seed for you to purchase. Let's take a look at some of the highlights of what you're going to find when you read the label on these products. Our shiny gold product here, the one that catches your eye from all the way across the store. 86% of this bag is actually mulch, and that's just to help you patch some of these areas of your lawn. Only 7.3% of this total bag is going to be actually grass seed. The other tricky thing about it is when we look at the types of grasses that are in these bags, none of these 3 bags had any tall fescue seed in them at all. And that's going to be one of our best cool season grasses for our area. This first bag here actually has 3% perennial ryegrass, which is going to struggle in the heat and the dry conditions. 3% of the fine fescue, which also struggles. 1.3% Kentucky bluegrass. So it'll do okay, but it's not quite as tough as the tall fescue is. Our weed seed percent and our other crop percent down here at the bottom were low, which is great. This 0.01% indicates still a high quality bag of grass seed. But when we look at the Midwest mix, for example, it's still 50% fertilizer and only 48% grass seed. You're still getting perennial ryegrass and fine fescue, which are going to struggle and potentially die out in the heat of summer. So you're, like I said, you're setting yourself up not to have a successful lawn all summer long. There are 4 types of Kentucky bluegrass in this bag, but again, the total percentage is only half of that 48%. So only about 25% of that grass seed was actually Kentucky bluegrass, and it was a mix of 4 different types. Which again, the blend is good. But we probably really want to look more towards tall fescue. The other tricky thing about this bag is the seed has an 80% germination. So that means 20% of our total 48%, or half of the bag that's grass seed, 20% of that grass seed isn't going to grow even if we sprinkle it out there and water it. So maybe that's something we're willing to work with. But that just means that we're going to need probably even more grass seed in order to really get a good, thick, uniform lawn. Same thing here with this sun and shade mix. I'm not trying to dog any brand or any one bag of grass seed, but I just want you to recognize this is what these bags of grass seed actually have in them if you go to purchase them. 20% annual ryegrass, and we talked about annual ryegrass earlier being an annual plant. It's gonna live for only part of the year and then die. So 20% of that grass seed is actually gonna die just because that's only an annual and not a perennial. And then the rest of the grass seed is these varieties that aren't going to really perform very well. You also have 1% other crop. And so that's a significant portion of other types of grasses, like some of our weedy grasses, that we really probably don't want to be planting when we're planting a new lawn. The sun and the shade mix here, again, this is perennial ryegrass, fine fescue, Kentucky bluegrass. You'll see on the label, if we look, it's about 50% fertilizer coating. And when we look at the total amounts, the Kentucky bluegrass here is only making up about 9 or 10% of the total bag. The rest of it is these fine fescue amounts and the perennial ryegrass amounts that aren't going to really do very well. Our germination here is also at 80%. But the good thing about this bag is there's fairly little weed seed in it, which is a good thing. And you have to read down here a little bit, other ingredients, and that 0.01% weed seed. If there are fertilizers mixed into the grass seed, it will tell you what types of fertilizers those are and at what percentage they are as well. If you thought looking at all those pictures, the Tall Fescue blend might be a good option, well, it is, but if we don't read the label, we're maybe shocked at some of the things we'll get to grow. This bag has 7 different varieties of Tall Fescue, which is good. That means there's a lot of genetic variability. There's about 20% of 3 different varieties in here, 15% of the 4th, and the other 3 are minimal, but still provide genetic diversity. The kicker on this bag is there's 1.5% other crop. The bag tells you that 1.4% of it is ryegrass, but it doesn't indicate whether it's perennial ryegrass or annual ryegrass. So you don't know if it's going to be a reoccurring problem or not. We also are then left with 0.1% mystery seed that we don't know what we're planting at all. Same thing with this weed seed. We have 0.1% weed seed, and it does tell us that there is annual bluegrass mixed in it, but it doesn't tell us what other weed seeds are maybe mixed in there. So like I said, hopefully that stresses the importance of selecting a high quality and paying a little bit more for a high quality grass seed, because if you're not planting the weed seeds, if you're not planting the other undesirable types of grasses, typically you're going to have a lot more success and a lot more healthy lawn, and especially if we're picking like Tall Fescue that's well suited to our environment. With Tall Fescue, typically you're going to need about 6 to 8 pounds of grass seed for every 1,000 square feet if you're planting a new lawn or you're starting over. If you're just overseeding, typically we're going to take half of that total amount. So if you're overseeding, typically you're going to need about 3 to 4 pounds of Tall Fescue seed for every 1,000 square feet of lawn that you're trying to plant, or overseed in that case. Kentucky bluegrass, like I said, is probably our second best cool season grass. Typically 2 to 3 pounds of 2 to 3 pounds of Kentucky bluegrass are going to be needed for every 1,000 square feet. Again, it's important that we're not planting too much grass seed here, because that's going to create a lot of competition among the grass, which is going to weaken it. And having too dense of a grass planting is also going to leave it prone to diseases later on in the year. We also don't want to go too short of that 6 to 8 pounds or the 3 to 4 pound recommendation, because we're then going to get a little bit of clumpy, thin lawn that's not going to look as attractive either. When it comes to actually planting that grass, whether we're overseeding or whether we're planting a new lawn and starting over, ideally we want to get as much soil to seed contact as possible. And so ideally that involves getting that grass seed about 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch deep in the ground. We don't need to plant it very deep, but we just kind of want to bury it over the top of the ground so that we get a good soil to seed contact that's going to hold moisture up to the seed, prevent the seed from drying out. And as you can see here, there's a wide variety of ways that we can achieve that good soil to seed contact and that good planting depth. The slit seeder is going to be, if you're going to rent a piece of equipment or maybe buy a piece of equipment, this is going to be your best option. Typically, the slit seeders are going to have solid blades. They're going to slice the soil, basically create pockets for those grass seeds to fall down into. And we're going to have a hopper here on the machine where we actually can pour that grass seed into the machine, and it's going to drop the seed directly behind the blade. Then there's another wheel on the back side of this machine that packs over or closes up those slits and actually gets that grass seed buried down into the soil in that 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch depth. Another option, if we're looking to rent a piece of machinery or maybe we have it, is a verticutter. Typically, verticutters are going to be more for removing thatch, and especially in our warm season lawns. But verticutters have these same solid blade-like cutting instruments underneath the machine. And so basically, if we use a verticutter, we want to go across our lawn, loosen the soil with the verticutter. Then we want to go across the lawn, spread the seed over the lawn. And then we want to come back with the verticutter a second time and basically you re-slice up that lawn and loosen the soil to hopefully pull some of that soil over top of the grass seed and mix that seed into the soil. If we're going to core aerate, this can be another way to get really good soil to seed contact. Basically, a core aerator machine is going to punch holes into the ground. Usually those holes are about 3 inches deep, and ideally we want those holes spaced about 3 inches apart. They look like little goose poop when they're pulled up and left on the surface of the lawn. So ideally, if we can core aerate and then punch all those holes across the grass, then we're good to go back in with a grass seed spreader and broadcast that seed. Some of the seed is going to fall into those holes. Some of it's going to get mixed into those plugs that are left on the ground. And all of those are just, again, going to increase the effectiveness of our soil to seed contact. The other option, if we're starting over or planting a new lawn, is we could use a rototiller and loosen up the ground, especially if it's heavily compacted. Ideally, after we rototill, we'll still want to use a roller or something to kind of firm up the grass. We don't want to, the ground, we don't want to pack it hard, but we want to be able to walk across it to spread the seed. But once that ground is loosened up and we've spread that seed, often if we just use a light rake to mix that seed into the soil, that'll be a great way to get that 1/4 of an 1/8 of an inch. And if you're wanting to go low budget, something that you have in your garage, a leaf rake or a hardscape rake will be an easy way. After you've spread that seed, go back and rake that seed into the soil, kind of just loosen that crust, and that's going to help you get that grass seed a little bit deeper and improve that contact. Another tip for spreading your grass seed is to really get best results. We're going to recommend that you apply that grass seed at a partial rate in multiple directions. And I'll show you a picture of what that means here in a minute. But ultimately, we're using the same total amount of grass seed. Nothing's changing there. We're just using it a little bit at a time to provide a more even and uniform distribution of that seed across the lawn. And so that's going to help us ultimately avoid completely missing areas of our lawn, having bare spots that don't get any grass seed at all. So when we look at what does that look like visually, if our goal is to have 6 to 8 pounds of tall fescue in a newly planted lawn, what we're going to do is we're going to take part of that, 2 to 3 pounds of that grass seed, and we're going to spread it going north and south across the lawn. Basically what we're calling pass 1 here in red. Then we're going to take the rest of that grass seed, the additional 2 to 3 pounds that we plan to apply, and we're going to go over that same area, but we're going to go in a perpendicular direction. So now we're running east and west across the soil, and that again is just going to help us from getting maybe areas where we have too much distance in between our spreader and not be able to have bare spots then. Beyond planting and purchasing the best grass seed possible, the next most important step, the second most important thing, is going to be watering. And we really need to make sure that we're keeping our soil moist when we're planting new grass seed, because this is important for seed germination. Ideally, once we get that grass seed spread, we want to soak the ground a couple inches deep to really provide that water in the soil. We want to make sure that our watering, when we apply it, is a gentle stream and it's not going to wash that seed away. And once that grass seed starts to grow, once it starts out putting out little roots into the ground, it's critical that we do not let that grass seed dry out, otherwise it'll die. We want to water that new grass seed frequently but lightly. Basically, we're watering it often, but with little amounts of water to basically just wet the soil surface right where that grass seed is, maybe that top ½ inch of soil. That's going to dry out during the course of the day, especially on days like today where it's sunny and hot. That soil is going to evaporate water. We want to make sure that we're not overwatering and that we're not getting to maybe this level of waterlogged soils. But it is important with newly planted grass seed to water lightly and often. On hot, dry days, that may mean watering 2, 3, 4 times a day on hot, dry days. But once we start to get later into September and it gets cooler, we maybe get calm or overcast days, we may be able to get away every couple of days providing water to that grass seed. So it's going to depend on when you plant and what the weather conditions are at that time. Our grass is also going to be a good indicator of how much water is needed. Ideally, what we want to be doing is lowering the amount of water that we provide to our grass over time. Because typically, once that grass is established, we only want to be watering it every 1, 2, maybe 3 days a week, depending on our soil type, so that we are encouraging deep root growth. Basically, on established grass, we want to be watering the opposite. We want to be watering infrequently and deeply, because the more deeply we can push that water, the more deeply those roots are going to grow in the soil. So gradually, as that grass seed grows and establishes, we gradually want to be decreasing the water amounts. If we can get it all the way to once a week on an established lawn, that's going to be great. But let the lawn tell you when it needs watered. Oftentimes, if you walk across the lawn, you'll see what we call the spring test here, where our footprints are actually getting left behind in the grass. And if that happens, that means there's not enough water in the cells of the plant for it to be able to pop back up or be what we call turgid. And so basically that means that more water is needed to this grass because it needs to be able to absorb that water to refill the grass blades for it to be able to stand back up. So that's a good way to evaluate if more water is needed. And ultimately with these steps, hopefully this is what we start to see after 3, 4 days, maybe a week after planting. It's all these little baby grass seeds starting to grow. And this is really the important time when watering is most critical because it's easiest for them to dry out right at this point. So just to recap on planting and overseeding, start with a high quality grass seed. You need a high quality grass seed to get a high quality lawn. If you can, apply that grass seed in multiple directions at multiple or half rates. Keep that seed bed moist as soon as you're done planting. And then it's often safe to mow once your grass seedlings reach a height of about 3 inches tall. That's about our ideal time to mow about 1/3 of that off. So I know there's been tons of questions that have come in. We'll take a couple of those now. Any of them that were related maybe to planting, purchasing seed or things like that.
So you mentioned tilling just a couple slides ago. Someone was told that tilling can bring up a lot of weed seeds.
So typically, if we're going to kill our lawn, we're going to be replanting soon after. And so if your lawn is, oh, sorry, you said tilling and not killing.
Tilling. Sorry.
Tilling, yes, it could bring up weed seeds because weed seeds are going to sit dormant in the soil. But oftentimes having bare ground can also create an opportunity for weed seeds to grow. Basically, those weed seeds are just waiting for the perfect opportunity. But like I said, the thing about planting in the fall is likely you're going to get less of those seeds to grow because it's cooler rather than if you did it in the spring. So I don't know if that helps. It is a possibility, but if you need to do a lot of grading work or you're starting with a blank slate, it may be the best option still. And it's okay. You need to till in fertilizers, soil amendments to adjust the pH, or add compost or organic matter to the soil.
Okay. So once you kill everything on your lawn with glyphosate, if you're starting over, how do you get rid of the dead material? Do you just rake it off by hand?
Sure. You could rake it off. You could set your mower to the lowest level possible and just mow it really short. You can rake it off, and oftentimes it depends on how thick it is. If it's not overly thick, you can maybe just plant right over the top of it as well, because the weed won't be growing, so it won't be competing with the grass. But like I said, I would probably just mow it short and grind it up that way, or like you said, rake it off.
Okay. There was another question about leaving roots from other dead grass, but I think that answers that as well. So you just talked about watering. How much water do trees take away from grasses under them? Do they need more water if there's like a risk of competition with tree roots?
Absolutely. Tree roots and grass roots are competing for the same things in the soil. They need water, they need space to grow, and they need nutrients. And so oftentimes, because our trees are larger, they're going to outcompete our grass. And so that's why our grass can oftentimes struggle in the dense shade. So if you do have areas with a large tree, you may need a little bit additional water because the tree is going to use some of that water that you apply and intend for the grass.
Okay. We have a couple of questions about warm season grasses. Did you want to, are you okay with going into that as well?
Yeah, well, let's maybe save some of those to the end. What I will say about warm season grasses, though, is that all of these techniques are going to be the same for warm season grasses. But typically with warm season grasses, we're going to be planting mid-May or June, maybe July, because that's when those grasses are going to grow. If you plant them now, they don't really have enough time to really get established before winter comes and they go dormant. So you can maybe still get some establishment, but oftentimes the winter is going to cause more injury than if we waited till the spring. And so if that's the case and you need to plant something now, maybe consider a cover crop or something like annual ryegrass that will either die out in the heat or that you can easily kill off a little bit later on.
Okay, good to know. That is good for now. I'll double check and make sure that answers those questions.
Okay.
We do have a question about what grass might be best in a clayish soil that has a dog that likes to scratch, maybe a grass that's resilient to a lot of action.
Sure. Oftentimes our warm season grasses like Bermuda and zoysia, buffalo grass, they're going to be a little bit more spreading. So they're going to be able to handle a little bit more traffic and able to fill back in if there are areas that are dug up. Where tall fescue is a clump forming grass, and so it's not going to spread and fill in very well unless you're replanting new grass seed in those areas. So the other tip that I might give you is if you do go with tall fescue, try to keep your pets off of it or off of it as much as possible while it gets established. And once you get that first couple mowings in, then let your pets back out on it, and that'll just help your grass seed really get a good head start and avoid some potential damage early on when they're more sensitive.
Okay, let's do one more.
Okay.
How do you loosen clay soil when it's dry?
And that's going to be a tough one. Maybe if you water a few days before you think about planting, that'll help loosen it. That verticutter, the grader, the slit seeder, all of those machines are going to help do that as well. And so that's why renting a machine for half a day or so may be a good option to help break up some of those soils. Adding organic matter may also help compost, for example, because that's going to help improve the drainage of the soil and keep it from getting quite as rock hard maybe.
Okay. And what do you think, this is kind of an add-on to that, what is a good way to add organic material to an established lawn?
Sure. So typically you can add organic matter about 1 or 2 inches in the late fall before we get into the dead of winter. Basically use a spreader or just throw it out there with a shovel about 1 to 2 inches thick or deep. And basically when we go through the freezing and the thawing, the contracting and expanding of the soils over the winter months, that's going to help incorporate some of that compost into the existing soil without you needing to till it or incorporate it manually.
Okay, we have a few more questions about fertilizer, but are you going to speak on that a little bit
We'll get to
more?
that in just a minute.
Okay,
Yep.
perfect.
So I don't keep going.
Okay,
But
sounds good.
The one question I do want to address though too is somebody asked about tenacity. Tenacity is about the only pre-emergent product that is safe for use around the time you seed. You still want to read and follow the label directions for yourself, but like I said, that is about the one exception to the rule. So just make sure you read that product carefully and understand before you use it. So with planting, we talked about seeding. That's probably going to be the most common thing. We can put out sod, and sod is probably a lot more common for our warm season grasses. Basically, the advantages of sod is we get that instant lawn. It's going to tolerate traffic sooner. So for the person who had the pet question, sod's going to be more expensive, but it's going to handle traffic from your pet a lot sooner. And basically sod, to clarify also, is going to be sections of grass or chunks of grass that have a root system that come with it. And so the benefit of sod is it also allows us more flexibility in when we plant it because it has that existing root system that comes with it. Sod does cost more though than seed, and so we may be limited on some of the varieties or cultivars that are available with our sod compared to seeds. So there's pluses and minuses either way, but I do, for those of you that want to lean more towards sod, want to give you just a little bit of information. If we're doing tall fescue sod, just like seeding, the timing is the same. Ideally, September is the perfect time to put down sod. You can go as early as September or August all the way through early November. Once we start to get into the dead of winter, it becomes a little harder to establish, but even until like late November, early December, we can still get pretty good sod establishment. Same thing in the spring, March to mid-May, because that sod already has an existing root system that it comes with. Usually we can get pretty good establishment there too. The important thing with sod is we just want to try to avoid the times that are the most critical, like the heat of the summer or the dead of the winter, because we want to hopefully have some root establishment into our existing soil before we get to those trying times. We do need adequate moisture to be able to establish sod so that the sod doesn't dry out. So that may be a limiting factor too. When planting sod, make sure that you get it from a reputable source. Make sure that it's freshly cut and hasn't set on a pallet for a few days or a few weeks, because it'll dry out and die. We also want to make sure that we try to loosen the soil below the sod before laying that sod down. And again, just trying to make it that much easier for those roots to be able to work their way into that existing soil. With sod, typically we want to lay it in what we call a brick-like pattern. And basically that means you stagger the pieces of sod that you lay down so that your seams don't line up in one long row. And basically you have like a checkerboard pattern then. Typically with sod, it's important to not stretch the sod apart to get it to fit in areas, because sod will dry down and shrink a little bit as it dries. And those bare soil areas are going to be places where weeds are going to creep in. If we have sod in areas where we have a steep slope, for example, we may need to use some landscape staples or something to stake that sod into place so that it doesn't slide off that hill or slide down the hill as we water it, trying to get it established. And lastly, with sod, if you do put sod down, we want to use some type of roller like this that's going to pack that sod down into the soil and basically push out air bubbles and increase the soil to see the root contact with our sod. We want to make sure that we water that sod heavily after we put it down. We not only want to get the sod wet, but we want to make sure that the ground underneath that sod also gets thoroughly wetted as well. With sod, until it's established, again, we want to irrigate frequently, making sure that the water is not only getting the sod wet, but getting the soil below the sod wet to encourage that root growth downwards. And usually sod is going to be rooted within 10 to 14 days. So it's, like I said, the quick way to get a lawn as well. A few more things that I want to make sure we cover before we get to the end of tonight's presentation is fertilization. And with fertilization, ideally what we're trying to get is grass that looks like this to grass that looks like this. And we may not want it waist high, don't get me wrong here. That's not the type of growth maybe we're looking for. But we're basically, with fertilization, trying to improve the overall health and vigor of our turf grass. And so September is critical for tall fescue fertilization and Kentucky bluegrass fertilization, because it's going to promote that overall denseness of our turf. September is a great time for our grass to be able to take advantage of those nutrients and put it and use it for root growth rather than just shoot growth. And having a healthy root system that we establish now is going to help carry that grass through the rest of the year. Fertilizing in the fall is also going to help build a food reserve, winter food, for our grasses to be able to survive the winter. And ultimately, that's going to help them green up earlier in the spring, but it's also going to help reduce the winter damage that we might see. And I want to show you a couple pictures here of our office. You can see these greener areas around the trees. We don't fertilize the lawns at our office, but we do fertilize the trees in our arboretum. And on March 10th, 2017, we had fertilized that previous fall, but you can see all the areas that we had put down that fertilizer in the previous fall, all the way in March, because the grass used that fertilization, just like the tree did, to work on root growth, and that allows it to green up earlier in the spring. So especially our November application is going to be critical for helping your grass green up earlier in the spring, if that's something you want to see. So with fertilization, typically we want to apply it 2 to 3 times a year on our tall fescue lawns. Ideally, September is the most critical time. Usually we want to put down between 0.5 and 1.5 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. And I'll show you what I mean by that here in a minute. But typically this fertilizer can be a mix of both slow release and quick release nitrogen, and both of those are going to help the overall growth of our plants. In November, that's going to be the second most critical time. So if we only fertilize once, September is the month to do it. If we're going to fertilize twice, November is going to be a good time to do that with about 1 pound of nitrogen for every 1,000 square feet. This fertilizer, it's going to be best if it's a quick release nitrogen source rather than a slow release, because that's going to be what helps build that energy reserve for that grass to green up earlier next spring. If you're going to water your grass all summer long and you want a really high quality tall fescue lawn, May would be the third and final time to fertilize in this grass, tall fescue. And again, we want about 1 pound of nitrogen at that application. Typically with these fertilizers though, in May, we want it to be slow release. We want a little bit of nitrogen to be released all summer long. And so that's why the slow release there is listed. You will notice that there is no spring fertilization for tall fescue. You see stores and commercials and ads and everybody pushing you to fertilize in the spring. But that's really not where research shows is the best time to fertilize. If we fertilize in the spring, oftentimes our weeds are going to be able to take better advantage of that fertilization than our grass does. So we really want to focus on fall fertilization of tall fescue so that we're establishing healthy roots that are going to carry us through the rest of the year, rather than fertilizing in the spring where that fertilizer basically gets used up for grass growth or top growth. And that just means we have to mow more frequently, and it's not really benefiting the health of the grass. So I mentioned that we want about 1 to 1.5 pounds of nitrogen in each of our applications. So there's a lot of different fertilizers we can use out there, and we always want to check to see what's in those fertilizers, just like we do our grass seed. No fertilizer is ever going to be 100% nitrogen. And so oftentimes, like this nitrate of soda, what you're going to see is 3 numbers, 16, 0, 0. And basically those 3 numbers are going to be percentages. So this, for example, is only a 16% nitrogen fertilizer. So the first number on the bag, you're always going to find these 3 numbers. The first number is always the percentage of nitrogen. And typically, most of our soils in Kansas, nitrogen is going to be the limiting factor. It's used up quickly by the plants, and it also is going to move with water. So it gets pushed down below where the roots can sometimes access it. Phosphorus is going to be our second number, and potassium is going to be our third. Typically, most Kansas soils are high in these 2 nutrients. So generally, unless the soil test tells us otherwise, we don't need a whole lot or any of these types of fertilizers. So with this, as you can see, nitrate of soda is basically 16% nitrogen and 0% phosphorus and 0% potassium. So if we go back and we want to look at our goal of 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet using this fertilizer, nitrate of soda, which we know is 16% nitrogen, to get the 1 pound of nitrogen, we actually need 7 pounds of that fertilizer to get to the ideal amount for every 1,000 square feet. So this number does not indicate the number of pounds that you need to put down. It doesn't indicate the number of fertilizer you need to buy. It just indicates the percentage of those nutrients. And so there can be a lot of math involved to try to figure out how many pounds of fertilizer you actually need to apply. And don't worry, don't freak out about the math. The lawn fertilization guide publication that we shared with you and that's shared again in the comments there is going to be a great publication for you to figure that out without having to do any mental math. So basically on the second page of this publication, you'll see the percent nitrogen of the different fertilizers all the way up to urea up here at 46%. And then it'll tell you the amount of square footage that you have. So basically you just look down the list with the type of fertilizer and the amount of space, and it tells you that you're going to need 43 pounds of fertilizer to get 1 pound of nitrogen per every 1,000 square feet. If you want to go 1.5 times, you would basically just multiply whatever number that intersects here by 1.5. But for 1 pound of nitrogen for every 1,000 square feet, this chart's gonna do all the math for you. And so like I said, you just find the top number that you're using and the side number for square footage that you're using and see where they meet up. The important thing though with fertilization is we always want to make sure that we're sweeping and blowing off the sidewalks, the streets, the curbs, the gutters, all of those things back into the lawn. And it doesn't matter if it's the fertilizer that we apply or the lawn clippings, the leaves that we cut, all of those contain nutrients. And if we don't put those back into the lawn, we're wasting our money letting those run down the drain, quite literally. But the other problem that this causes and that we see so frequently is it causes tons of algae blooms and algae problems in a lot of our community ponds and waterways. Because if everybody's doing this, it all runs down the street and it all runs into the gutter and all runs from the gutter into our waterways. And so the more that we can clean up after ourselves, the more we can help protect the quality of our water. I'm gonna run through a couple more sections here and then we'll stop for questions. Why core aerate? Core aeration, we talked about a little bit ago, punches those holes in the ground. Basically, the best thing that this does is it really reduces the compaction in our soil, which are gonna limit growth. So if we have a thin, weak grass, oftentimes we have compacted soils from either heavy foot traffic, pet traffic, something like that. And once we start to get a lot of compaction in our soil, weeds love compacted soils, so they can easily invade those areas much more easily than our turf grass can. So by core aerating, we're reducing thatch, we're improving the water infiltration of our soil, we're also allowing more nutrients to infiltrate deeper into the soil, and we're also allowing oxygen supplies to go deeper into the soil. And all of those things basically are going to encourage deeper, stronger, healthier roots, which is what carries that grass through all year long. So with aeration, there's about 3 different ways that you can do it. Core aeration is like you saw in that last picture where it takes plugs of soil and sets them on the surface. That's going to be our most effective type of aeration. There's spiking aeration where basically you have solid metal tines, kind of think of like pitchforks tines that basically poke small holes in the ground. It's going to cause the least amount of damage to the turf, but also has probably a shorter term effect because those holes fill in very quickly. Another option to core aerate or to aerate your lawn is verticutting or power raking. Basically, that's going to stimulate and break up the compaction that might be on the crust of the ground, but it's not going to get very deep. It is going to help you control thatch. And if you don't want to do any of these, oftentimes our earthworms and the worms that we have in the ground, that's nature's decompaction mechanisms, the things that are aerating our ground. So if we see a lot of worm activity, that's great in our lawn because it's actually reducing compaction and improving this aeration all on its own. If we are core aerating, just like we talked about earlier, typically we want these plugs to be about 2 to 3 inches deep. We want to pull them up and leave them on the soil surface. If you don't like looking at them, just mow over them with the mower and break them up into smaller pieces. And ideally, we want to get those holes about every 3 inches apart from one another. And so it'll probably take a couple passes with the core aerator machine to get that close. We want to core aerate before we fertilize, before we seed, or before we put down pre-emergent products so that those types of things can work their way a little bit deeper into the soil. Like I said, leave those cores right on the surface. They're naturally going to break down on their own, and that's going to help not only decompose thatch, but also improve the soil structure. And the big thing with core aeration is don't do it once and give up, because research really shows that you need 3 consecutive years of core aeration to really get the most impact out of your lawn. So if you just do it once, you'll see some benefits, but if you do it 3 or more years, that's really when you start to see the improvements to your soil health. So the results are worth the wait, so don't give up after just one time if you can. Last thing I want to end on tonight is just controlling some of those pesky weeds that we get in our lawn. And basically what you define as a weed is going to be different for every single one of you. But basically a weed is any plant out of place. So that can be a dandelion in our lawn, that can be a petunia in a sidewalk, that can be a red tulip in a field of yellow tulips. Any plant out of place can be considered a weed. And everybody's gonna have their own definition of what makes a weed in their own lawn. So it's up to you to decide whether or not you want dandelions or clovers or all kinds of different things, nut sedge in your lawn. And everybody's gonna have their own tolerance for it. Basically, the best thing we can do for weed control is have a healthy plant competition and a healthy lawn. Because the healthier our lawn is, the more that our lawn is going to be able to outcompete those pesky weeds that might try to creep in. So September in the fall is ideal for weed control because oftentimes these weeds are moving their nutrients and energy down into the roots to survive the winter. So when we apply products on the weeds at this time of year, those chemicals are actually taken down to the roots and kill the plant root and all so that they don't come back year after year. Versus if we do it in the spring, most of that energy is traveling the reverse direction from the roots into the leaf. So it's a lot harder to control a lot of our perennial weeds. So weed control is tough. There's never one simple solution for it. So don't let this be your idea of weed control. With weed control, typically we have two categories of products, selective chemicals and non-selective chemicals. We've talked about non-selective chemicals like glyphosate earlier. Basically, those type of products are going to kill all plant material that it's applied to. For weed control, though, in lawns, we do have what we call selective products, and these only kill certain plant material and are usually going to be safe on grasses. So oftentimes they'll kill the broadleaf weeds without damaging our turf, but it's still important to read the label and double check that that's going to be the case. These selective products are going to be great because most cases, and especially on tall fescue lawns, they're going to kill our weeds like dandelions, but not kill the established lawns that we have. Again, be very careful when applying them to a newly planted lawn, but typically these are going to be most effective if we apply them from mid-October to early November. Usually our weeds like dandelions, for example, produce one last flush of growth and flowers in the fall. And so by September, most of those new seeds are growing in the lawn. So not only do we get the existing weeds, but we also start to get those young weed seedlings that are starting to grow. Like I said, it's important to understand what product you're putting down if you have a newly planted lawn. There is a waiting period between when those products can be put down and when it's safe to put down grass seed. Usually that's 4 weeks to a couple months, depending on the product. So always read the label when it comes to timing. If we've planted a new lawn now and we want to come back later on and put down a selective chemical, what we want to do is make sure that we've mowed our lawn at least 2 to 3 times before we put down those products. And basically that just bulks up our lawn so that it's a little safer to get it done and not damage our grass. Not all chemicals are safe on all types of grass. So if you have buffalo grass, for example, again, read the label to understand that it is safe for your specific type of grass. Oftentimes with things for like dandelion control, we'll look for what we call combination products. Usually that's a combination of 2,4-D, dicamba, and MCPP. You'll find it under 1,001 different brand names at the store, but basically it's a mix of those 3 chemicals in most cases. Those are going to be ideal for dandelion control because anywhere from that late October to early November, they're going to be very effective. If it starts to get too cold in the fall, we may want to look for a chemical called carfentrazone because carfentrazone is going to be effective when temperatures get below 50 degrees. The label on most of these combination products are going to need a little bit warmer temperature. So if we start to get colder and you haven't controlled some of these weeds, look for carfentrazone because it is safe to put out and effective in colder temperatures. If we have things like wild violets, clovers, or cranesbill geranium that are taking over, triclopyr is going to be a great active ingredient that's going to be effective on all of those types of weeds. Typically, again, late October to early November is still ideal for control. If we have grassy weeds like sandbur or crabgrass, quinclorac is going to be the product that we would look for. The important thing though with like crabgrass, for example, is it dies at the first frost. And so if we just wait, this crabgrass is going to be done here within the next month or 2, just because we'll be getting into that cold weather. Nutsedge is also a very common weed that we see in our lawns. Typically though, we want to make sure that we're catching this in the early spring to early summer before they start to produce a lot of tubers underneath. It's going to take multiple applications to get nutsedge, and usually halosulfuron or sulfentrazone are going to be our most effective products. The thing that you'll notice about nutsedge versus your lawn, typically it grows much faster than your lawn, and if you go to pick it, it's going to have a triangular stem. We can also preventively control a lot of weeds using pre-emergent products in the fall, especially henbit and chickweed. So I'm going to skip ahead here because I do want to get to questions. So the combination products we talked about earlier, they will be effective in the late October to early November against henbit, chickweed, some of our winter weeds. But one of the most effective things to do is put down a pre-emergent product in the early to mid-September if we are not overseeding or planting new grass seed. These pre-emergents stop all seeds, weed seed or grass seed, and so we want to make sure that we don't limit the success of our planting. Typically prodiamine, which is going to be barricade, or dithiopyr, which is dimension. Typically, these are going to be the best products to look for because they give us season-long control for a couple months of control. So if we put them down in mid-August to mid-September, we're going to get good control of annual bluegrass, henbit, chickweed with barricade or dimension all season long, all the way through the spring. Little barley is a common weed that we deal with, especially in our warm season lawns. You want to read the label to make sure the product is listed to control little barley. Typically, orilazine is going to be a great product for little barley control. But if you want that season-long control, that multiple-month control, dimension, that dithiopyr product is going to be effective. The thing with little barley is it starts to grow a little bit earlier than some of our other winter weeds. So we have to have those pre-emergents out before the weed starts to grow. So we need to make those applications about the mid-August time frame. So just to recap, a healthy lawn is going to be the best way that we can prevent weeds because they're going to crowd out and outcompete those weeds. We want to make sure that we have the right mowing height to reduce weeds, and ideally 2 to 3 inches tall is going to be ideal for our tall fescue lawns. A little bit shorter if we have some of those warm season grasses. Weeds are going to start if we're improperly watering and maybe our grasses are too wet. Our grasses are able to compete less when they're overwatered, and so typically our tall fescue needs about 1 to 1.5 inches of water per week. We can apply that all at once or over 2 or 3 days, depending on the type of soil we have. And typically weeds are going to benefit with over-fertilization. So don't over-fertilize and don't fertilize at the wrong time. September and November are ideal for tall fescue. And that soil compaction, core aerating is really going to help improve the root health of our grass, which improves the overall health of our grass, making it more competitive against our weeds. So definitely want to get to questions now. We'll go a few minutes long tonight if that's okay with everybody to make sure we get some of the questions that you're looking for.
Sure. So first, just in relation to that fertilizing and well, in relation to the pre-emergence, is there a time difference that's needed in between putting down fertilizer and applying your pre-emergence?
No, you can put down a pre-emergent and a fertilizer at the same time, but you just want to not be putting down a pre-emergent if you're overseeding or planting new grass.
Okay. Is nitrogen toxic to kids or animals?
That's a good question. I mean, any nutrient in a high enough level could be toxic, but when we're putting it down on our grass, like I said, it moves very quickly with water. So you put it down, you water it in, it's going to go into the soil. And so I wouldn't be too concerned about it being toxic as long as you're reading the fertilizer label and following the instructions on the bag. The EPA creates those labels for your protection and your safety. And so if you follow those, you shouldn't have to be worried.
Okay, good to know. If you have sandy soil, do you need to fertilize more?
You might need to, and typically with our sandy soils, they're going to be a little bit lower in phosphorus and potassium, just because those nutrients get pushed out of the soil with the water. So you may need to fertilize a little extra, yes, if you have a sandy soil, but a soil test would help you know that for sure too.
Okay. Back to seed real quick. What is considered an out-of-date seed?
So it depends on how the seed is stored. Seed can typically last for several years, and especially if it's stored properly in a cool and dry location. If it's left out in a shed where it gets really hot over the summer, or maybe a detached garage, the longer it sits, typically the less germination you're going to get. So what I would recommend is maybe plant a small section of the seed before you do the whole lawn and see if anything comes up. Or take a napkin, put some grass seed in the napkin, fold another napkin on top, get it wet, and put it in a Ziploc bag and see within a couple days how much of that grass seed comes up. And that'll give you a good indication of whether or not that grass seed is still any good.
Okay. Circling back to watering, when should you stop watering in the fall?
That is a great question. So if we're getting rainfall that's accounting for that 1 to 1.5 inches of water per week, then we can stop. Once the ground starts to freeze, we can stop. But there's not necessarily a hard and fast rule when to stop. It just is a matter of making sure that we don't have too dry of a conditions, because oftentimes when we think about drought, we think about it in the summer, but winter drought is definitely a problem here in Kansas too when we don't get snow or rainfall. It's usually a bigger problem on our trees, but it can impact grass as well and contribute to grass not coming back in the spring.
Okay. Overseeding. Is there any benefit to overseeding some in the fall and also in the spring?
You could. I mean, basically you just don't want to get too thick of a grass. You can overseed in the spring. Some people prefer it. But like for some of the reasons we mentioned earlier, typically we'd recommend it in the fall. And especially if you can get it done earlier in September to get good establishment for the winter. But sometimes winter seedings, if we do them late enough, they have some dieback because of the winter. And so we may need to do a little overseeding in the spring as well.
Okay. A couple of warm season grass questions as well.
Mm-hmm.
When should you fertilize warm season grass like buffalo and Bermuda?
Sure. Typically, just like we mentioned earlier, most of our warm season grasses by mid-May into June is going to be the ideal time to fertilize. Same techniques apply. It's just a different time of year because they grow a little bit differently and they perform better in the heat and the drought. So typically buffalo grass is going to be fertilized in June. Bermuda grass and zoysia grass are often fertilized 2 to 4 times a year, and that's in May, June, July, and potentially August. Early August, though.
Okay. Back up to the beginning. Wants to know what they could use to kill Johnson grass without killing a newly planted Bermuda grass lawn.
That's a great question, and that's something that I'd have to do a little research on and find out for you. Maybe Angie can put our garden hotline email address in the chat box there. And so if we don't get to your question, and if that one specifically we need to do a little more research on, email us and we'd be happy to look into it for you and let you know.
All right, good to know. Another one, the height for mowed grass. What's the best height for mowed grass?
Sure. And so let me back up a slide or two here. Depends on the type of grass you have.
Oh, there it is.
With our tall fescue, we want to be mowing it about 2 to 3, maybe 3.5 inches tall. Bermuda grass and zoysia grass can be mowed much shorter and much more carpet-like. It handles that very well. So Bermuda and zoysia is typically in that 1 to 2 inch height, and then buffalo grass anywhere between 2.5 to 4 inches tall.
Okay. Angie, I don't know if you're on here, if you saw that I missed any or if any more new ones came in. Oh, I see here a new one. Will a high pH irrigation source cause high pH in soil? Is it possible to keep up with sulfur to lower the pH if irrigation is the source?
That's a great question. And I think you can have an impact by adjusting your soil pH with sulfur to lower it. But the reality is it takes time to do that. It takes determination and it takes repeat applications of sulfur to achieve that. So we do want to make sure that we're using a high quality irrigation water. And oftentimes the problem we see here in Wichita is a lot of our well water is high in salts, and so buildup in the soil can be a problem. But oftentimes if we fertilize correctly, if we water correctly and fertilize correctly, we can, with our maintenance practices, avoid a lot of those problems, I think.
All right. I don't know. Angie, do you see any that I missed? Oh, I think here's one. Is it too, I think you may have answered this. Is it getting too late to kill Bermuda or to reseed with fescue or sod?
Sure. Ideally with Bermuda, if you're going to try to get rid of Bermuda to plant a tall fescue lawn, ideally you would kind of start in the July and August timeframe. Bermuda typically takes several applications to get complete control. You can still apply something now to kill it and you'll still get some control. But oftentimes we recommend starting in like mid to late July, application, mowing it off when it gets brown, watering the lawn or the bare soil so that if there's any Bermuda that's still alive, it starts to come back up. over a 2-week period and then spray it a second time, and that'll help control it. So it's not too late, but just realize that even if you spray it now, you may not get good or complete control. You still could get good control, but just maybe not 100%.
Okay. Is there a risk of harming tree surface roots with using weed killer when you're trying to kick out your old lawn?
It's a great question. Typically, a lot of our weed killers are going to be most damaging if you get it on green plant tissue. And so if there's suckers that are coming up from the roots of your tree, you definitely don't want to get it on that. You don't want to get it on any open wounds or open cuts, open gashes in the trunk of the tree, because it could be absorbed into the tree that way. It depends on the product, but oftentimes things like glyphosate, they're going to be fairly harmless to the bark of the tree as long as it's not getting on any green plant tissue on the tree. So read the label, understand the product you're using, but some of them are not as damaging as others.
Okay, one more, I think. If you are having areas of yellowing, is it more likely disease or watering issues if most of the lawn is green?
That is a great question. There's lots of things that can cause yellowing in our lawns. Sometimes it's the type of grass that we have. If people have more annual ryegrass or some of these other types of grasses, they'll tend to yellow a little bit more. It could be over or under watering, absolutely. Sometimes grub issues are a problem as well, where grubs feed on the roots of the plant, and so the plant just dies off rather quickly in the heat this time of year when grub feeding is the worst. So it's hard to have a straight across the board answer, but I would say all of those things that you mentioned are a possibility.
Okay, this is more of a question from me. All of the links and stuff, those were sent to all of the participants in their registration, right? Okay, I just wanted to clarify. A couple of the links looked like they maybe weren't working quite properly, but all the links referenced are going to be in that email that was sent to you with your registration.
Yes.
Okay, good deal. Oh, there's another one. Do you want to take that one? What is the difference between a slit seeder and an overseeder?
It's a great question, and it may just be a difference in terminology. The biggest thing with a slit seeder is typically there's a hopper on the machine that's going to allow you to put the grass seed into the machine, and the machine lays down the grass seed. Or sometimes an overseeder, or what I think you might be referring to as a verticutter, typically there's no hopper for that, so those machines just slice the ground, and you have to come back with a spreader or something later to spread that seed.
All right, well, I think we hit all the questions, Matt.
Well, thank you all for joining me tonight. I really appreciate you being here and all the great questions you asked.
Thank you, Matt, for that great presentation. And we really appreciate the help of Angie Maven and Lindsay Feather for tonight's program. One thing we'd like to ask of all of our participants is that you give us your feedback on the program. You can look in the chat box, and Sean provided a link to a survey where you can share your experience and give us ideas for future programs. The other way you can get to that is to go back to the email where we shared the link to tonight's program, and there's also a link to that same survey. Now, this is the last program of this particular series. There will be another series coming up in spring, so you can be looking for that on the library's website. And that is where you can also find information about other programs we're hosting this fall. That link is www.wichitalibrary.org, and be looking for our events page to see what we've got going on at the library. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and this will end our presentation.